Thank you, colleagues, for inviting me to come along and say a few words this evening. And I'm very sorry that I was a wee bit late, because I know that I'm keeping everyone from the genuinely enjoyable part of this conference, which is the networking and the opportunity to share ideas and indeed to comment on just how bad the politicians' speeches were in the liberty of the bar. But one thing I wanted to congratulate you on, as well as the success that the network has enjoyed and that its constituent members have enjoyed over the course of the last 12 months, was the choice of title and theme for this year's conference. In proclaiming that every child has talent, you've done two things. The first is affirm a principle which I think is the single most important one in education: the belief that whether it's academic or vocational, whether it's creative or technical, whether it's sporting or literary, that within every child there will be a spark that can be kindled, a talent that can be nurtured, an ability which will allow them to feel that they've achieved everything of which they're capable. And one of the things which I want to thank you for is that that principle, the belief that every child has talent, governs the way in which so many of you have led your schools so successfully for some time now. Because the belief that every child has talent is the essence of the comprehensive ideal. The belief that within any community, if sufficient time is taken and sufficient professional skill is devoted to nurturing young people, then we can ensure that whatever the mix of cognitive or academic ability, every child will have a share in success, and every child will leave that school capable of progressing and capable of achieving everything of which they're capable. But there's another reason as well why I liked the theme, every child has talent. Because it reminded me a little, of course, of one of our most popular television reality shows, Britain's Got Talent. And I'm a great fan both of Britain's Got Talent and also of the X Factor. And as you may appreciate, within the X Factor, those of you who've been following it of a Saturday evening, there was a big change this year. Not just the disappearance of Simon Cowell and his replacement by Gary Barlow, but also during the course of X Factor, one of the groups, Rhythmics, changed its name from Rhythmics to Little Mix. Now, I thought about Rhythmics when I was on my way up here, reflecting on the fact that the school's network used to be, until very recently, the SSAT. And I thought, is there a parallel between them? And actually there is. Because Rhythmics relies on some amazing talents working in collaboration. And even though the name may have changed, when you see them perform, you feel a sense of uplift and excitement. And you are all, in a way, the little mix of the school system. Your name may have changed, the organisation may be taking on a new direction and new responsibilities. But the mix of talent is still there, and it's by working in collaboration as a network that so much has been achieved. And I want to say a little bit this evening about networks, because I believe that the orientation that the SSAT has taken, the new leadership that is being shown, reflects two of the most profound changes that are affecting education at the moment, and which will help all of us unlock the talent of the next generation. I think we need to look at networks in the way in which schools cooperate between themselves and improve. I also think we need to reflect on networks within the classroom and what networks, especially digital and technical networks, are allowing us to do in order to tap the abilities of every child. Now, the reason that I stress the importance of networks is that I believe that the 21st century will belong to those countries, those systems, those structures that are as flexible and adaptable as possible. And that's the principle behind a network. It's a structure that isn't rigid but open. It's a structure which isn't hierarchical but sharing. And I believe that our approach towards the reform of the school system reflects the importance of being innovative and adaptable and unlocking the talent that exists within the corpus of teachers and head teachers whom we're so fortunate to have working in our schools at the moment. And that conviction on my part is partly a reflection of what I see in the very best schools, when a greater degree of autonomy has been granted and people are capable of using that autonomy for the good of all, not just the students that they themselves teach, but others outside their gates. But it's also been driven by a rigorous look at the international evidence. And we know from the most systematic studies of what characterize high-performing education systems that it is autonomy at the level of the principal or head teacher that drives improvement. Now, that autonomy needs to be twinned with a rigorous accountability system. And in order for that autonomy to be used to the full, principals and head teachers need to have the confidence of knowing that there is a professional graduate teacher workforce that is improving with every year and upon whom they can draw in order to make their schools work better than ever. And while it's my responsibility to ensure that that accountability system is nuanced and sensitive and intelligent, and our shared responsibility to ensure that we can create an environment that is attractive for the next generation of talented professionals, I think it is my particular responsibility to ensure that you enjoy a progressively greater level of autonomy. And the OECD, in their most recent PISA study, which was launched just under a year ago, argued persuasively that in those countries where schools have greater autonomy over what is taught and how students are assessed, students perform better. And the OECD was rigorous in establishing that two of the most successful countries in PISA, Hong Kong and Singapore, were those countries with the highest level of autonomy at principal level and also the greatest level of choice for parents between different schools. And if we look at other high-performing jurisdictions, not just countries, but provinces like Alberta in Canada, or what's happened with the growth of charter schools in New York and Chicago, we can see that those schools with the greatest autonomy have the greatest potential to drive success. And it's because I'm such a convinced believer in the virtues of autonomy that I've been trying to ensure that all schools and all principals have more freedom to concentrate on the single most important priority that they have, improving teaching and learning. So I've tried to make sure that additional bureaucracy is removed from all schools. For FIMSIS, as far as I was concerned, a time-consuming process that was all about a system and not an output has gone. The Ofsted self-evaluation form, which led you by the nose instead of trusting you to judge what was good in your school, that's gone too. The constant stream of emails from the department updating you with the latest thoughts from the Secretary of State's desk, gone. Performance management guidance, we've managed to strip out 75% of the extraneous material. Capability procedures, when you do need to work with staff who are underperforming and who may need to move on, simplified and the time period shortened. The Ofsted framework, which had far too many areas on which a school was judged, and limiting judgments which actually overshadowed the central work that so many of you do, that's been slimmed down. And under a new chief inspector, who's very much in the tradition of the old HMIs, we have someone who recognises the importance of teaching and learning above all. And guidance on issues like behaviour and bullying, where your judgment is always going to be better than mine. Again, the guidance has been cut from more than 600 pages under the last administration to just 50. And this initial burst of energy, which couldn't have been accomplished without the support of the head teachers reference group in the department and the input of professionals at the front line and the dedication and expertise of Department for Education civil servants, this initial burst of reforming energy will continue. More guidance will be slimmed down, and critically, our curriculum review will result in a clearer and slimmer approach to the body of knowledge that all students have a right to enjoy. And in that respect, I was particularly encouraged by one document that I came across, which was the SSAT's, as it then was, submission to the Labour Party policy review, which was submitted to Andy Burnham, who was, until recently, Labour's education spokesman. I found myself nodding along with all of the points that were made by the SSAT team. But there was one particular point that resonated with me. One of the arguments, very persuasively put, was that when it came to programmes of study for national curriculum subjects, a far greater degree of freedom should be extended to schools, to learned societies, to outside bodies in developing those programmes of study. And one of the things that I would like to explore with the schools network is which subjects, at which key stages, with which programmes of study, would it be appropriate for you to take the lead rather than the department in shaping a curriculum that is genuinely fit for the 21st century. And I think it's important in extending that greater degree of freedom and autonomy to the profession to help design that curriculum that we emphasise that we're doing so because we recognise that any curriculum which is designed centrally, while it may have the benefit, as Michael Barber has pointed out, of helping an education system move from adequate to good, needs to transform itself if the education system is going to be transformed from good to great. And that's the journey that we're on, and we will only achieve that if we, in Michael's words, unleash greatness, and that means having you play a critical role in developing curriculum materials that we can all share. Now, in stressing that that's more freedom for professionals, and stressing that it's a freedom that will lead to sharing, it takes me on to something else as well, which is the importance of collaboration alongside autonomy and independence in any network. I'm delighted that there are so many schools that haven't just taken advantage of the freedoms that are available to all, but have taken the next step to go on to become academies. It's a natural outgrowth of the greater degree of professional leadership that was there in the original sponsored academies and in those schools that took on specialist status right from the beginning. And I'm overjoyed that there are now 1,400 academies across England, and more than 40% of all secondary schools are now either academies or in the process of becoming academies. And the original ambition that we stated in opposition, that academy status should be the norm for secondary schools, is becoming a reality. And it's also the case that more and more primary schools are considering it appropriate to opt for academy status. And at the same time as schools take on these responsibilities and these new freedoms, it's also the case that the number of underperforming schools who are operating as sponsored academies has grown. There are now 319, 116 of them have opened since May 2010, and there are another 44 which are expected to open in this academic year. So we're now at a position where more than 1 million pupils are being educated in academy schools, around 1 in 7 pupils in the maintained state sector overall, and 1 in 3 pupils in secondary schools. All of these pupils are benefiting from the changes that academy freedom brings: longer school days, better paid teachers, more personalised learning, improved discipline, and a goad to higher standards all round. And it's the sheer multiplicity of ways in which academies are using those freedoms and helping other schools that makes a reality of a self-improving, system-led schools and education system. The way in which I've been impressed by individual principals who've taken it upon themselves, for example, to re-alter the whole rhythm of the school term and school year in order to ensure that the summer holiday is shorter, so that learning is more focused, and so that half-term or other opportunities for parents to take off-peak holidays is greater, is just one practical way in which academy status has been deployed. But there are so many others. The way in which there's been increased focus through curricular flexibility on making sure that underperforming children in Year 7 reach an appropriate level in literacy and numeracy. The way in which links have been forged with employers or with higher education institutions in order to raise aspiration and make sure that children take a more enlightened view of progression. The way in which additional money has been used in order both to reduce class sizes and also to buy in support from education welfare officers, from social workers, or from additional specialist teachers. All of these are hugely encouraging developments. But I recognise that the essence of a network, as I underlined earlier, is collaboration, and I also recognise that the motive spirit for most people who are in education is to work together and to be part of a team. And therefore there is sometimes, I know, inevitably, that reflection on the part of those who are leading academy success: is my success and my autonomy somehow at the expense of others? And it's certainly a trope or a theme that is rehearsed by some, though not all, of our political opponents. The idea that we're creating a two-tier school system, with academies being the good boys and girls and the others being the recalcitrants at the back of the class. But the truth is that actually the process of academy conversion has helped all schools in two powerful ways. The first is genuinely through the creation of new higher standards which others feel that they have to learn from and emulate. Recently, the London School of Economics published a landmark assessment of the Academies programme, and they discovered that academy conversion generated a significant improvement in pupil performance. And they reinforced that finding by showing that the improvement wasn't the result of academies cream skimming or scooping up middle-class pupils from nearby schools. If there was any growth in the number of children from wealthier homes, it was a consequence of academies' success, not a cause. But the critical thing was that academies were, by raising standards for their own pupils, also acting as a competitive spur to other schools. And we'd seen it before with the establishment of city technology colleges, and we'd also seen it through the work of the London Black Country and other challenges. So the very existence of a greater degree of autonomy and innovation creates new ways of working that others will want to emulate in order to raise their own standards. But critically, it's not just through that process of innovation and emulation that the network operates, it's also through the direct growth of new relationships. When the Academies programme started, the role of sponsor was generally held by a wealthy individual or individuals who were bringing money, contacts, sometimes additional professionalism into the front line of education. Most of them were heroic figures. One or two of them weren't. But I felt at the time that it was rather a narrow pool of individuals who were being invited to play a part in helping to improve state education. And what's been most exciting about the growth of the Academies programme over the last 18 months, 2 years, is the way in which more and more sponsors are leaders in education. So we see more sponsorship from higher education and further education institutions, but critically, and this is the most encouraging thing of all, more sponsorship from the head teachers of other high-performing schools. And I love the way in which Tudor Grange Academy in Solihull, a high-performing school which I had the privilege of visiting when I was in opposition, is now making a huge difference through its direct sponsorship of what had been one of the worst-performing schools in Worcester. I'm hugely encouraged by the way in which Altrincham Grammar School for Girls is making a huge difference in East Manchester, with secondary and primary schools catering for a very different group of students benefiting from that collaboration. And there are others, many of them in this hall, who've been on that journey. There are people like Mike Wilkins and Barry Day who have themselves become the leaders not just of one outstanding school which others wish to emulate, but groups of schools where collaboration is embedded in the way of working. And I would like to see that collaboration grow. I think that there is room for more chains of great schools. I believe that those chains are best led by people who have already established themselves as leaders in education. I'm specifically delighted that the National College for School Leadership, through the establishment of 100 teaching schools, is helping us ensure that there is a growing cadre of great school leaders who can take on this role. And I think if we can ensure that we provide for all school leaders the level of support, encouragement and resource that we have in the past, then we can grow a generation of leaders who are capable of transforming education by ensuring that its teachers, living, working, breathing, serving teachers, not ex-teachers, not bureaucrats, not politicians who wish they'd been teachers, but teachers who are leading improvement in our school system. So that's what I understand by a network theory of school improvement. But I also said that I wanted to say a little bit more about networks within classrooms, and specifically the way in which, even as we change to take account of the evidence internationally, how our whole school system works, we need to change to take account of the evidence of what's changing technologically to make sure that every child receives an education which is effectively tailored for their needs. Some of you may have read the New Scientist editorial, which was written to mark Steve Jobs' tragically early death. In it, the editorial writer says. Nothing dates the 1987 movie Wall Street like the $4,000 cell phone clutched by Gordon Gekko. It was the size of a brick, and he could only talk for 30 minutes before having to recharge it. In the 1980s, the New Scientist explained, the capabilities of today's smartphones would have been unfathomable to consumers and engineers alike. The iPhones, which I imagine many of you have, would have simply been creations that their imagination could not have comprehended. They would have thought it was impossible that so much powerful technology could be packed into such a tiny case. And recently a group of scientists were asked, if you tried to build an iPhone now with all the capability that it has, using the components, just the components that you had in the 1980s, how big would that phone be? Running through all the parts, from the antennas to the batteries to the GPS to the gyroscope to the accelerometer to the cameras to the mobile computing capability and more, New Scientists concluded that you would need a truck to haul around an iPhone built of 1985 parts. So, in the space of just 26 years, we've gone from requiring an 18-wheeler Arctic to something that you could hold in the palm of your hand. The speed and scale of technological change is something that we all acknowledge, but something which hasn't yet changed education as it should. We know that so many of the workplaces of today have been transformed. We know that if you go to a car assembly plant, where once there would have been hundreds of skilled men, toolmakers and others on that assembly plant, now there are far fewer, and the fewer workers who are there are all trained essentially to work with robots and microprocessing technology rather than to engage in metal bashing. We know that if you were to go into an operating theatre now, it would be unimaginably different from 25 years ago. If you go into a newspaper office now, you will see that compared to 30 years ago, when the rancid smell of cigarette smoke and the occasional bottles of Bell's whiskey everywhere and the clatter of the typewriter let you know that you were in a particular type of environment, now you'll go in and you'll find figures hunched over desktops in a clean and antiseptic environment, which could be almost any office. Technology has changed all these workplaces. But if you were to take a Rip Van Winkle teacher from 100 or 120 years ago and put them into some of our classrooms, not just in England, but across the world today, then they would be struck by how little had changed. The children might be better fed, the teacher might be better dressed. But apart from the fact that perhaps the layout of the class might be slightly different, and it was a whiteboard rather than a blackboard, much of the teaching and learning, in style and at first appearance, would seem uncannily similar. Now, I think, given how much technology has changed other workplaces, we, and in particular the Department for Education and its ministers, have been behind the curve in appreciating what we need to do. Now, I know that ministers in the Department for Education, because of the stress that we've placed on academic excellence and raising the bar, are sometimes accused of wanting to go back to the 1950s, caring more about Tennyson than technology, Ibsen rather than iTunes, more about Kubla Khan than the Khan Academy. But I don't see that there's any tension between demanding high standards of every child and insisting that they have access to this rich intellectual inheritance, and also reflecting on how technology can make that more real for them. And indeed, how they can open themselves up to a broader vista of learning than any of us could ever have imagined when we started out in education ourselves. I do think that collectively, we in the English education system have been slow to appreciate this change because quite a lot of our investment of time and money in the past has been in hardware. And unfortunately, much of that investment has been in machines that have rapidly become obsolete. And on reflection, I think that our investment should have been rather more in training individuals at every level in education to be as literate and adept as they can be. And I think that increasingly we need to refocus our investment and our thinking on human capital, because we have to face the fact that the technology that's in the hands of the students whom we teach, the iPhones and the tablets that I was referring to earlier, will be of a sophistication and will be updated more rapidly than anything that we could provide centrally. And so for that reason, we need to reflect not so much on the platforms as on the content and on the organizations that are taking advantage of those platforms to give ever more demanding and testing content. So, for example, iTunes U, which I mentioned earlier, now gives everybody, in many cases free, access to the world's best lectures. Any of us can listen to Michael Sandel giving his world-famous lectures on justice from Harvard University at the click or flick of a couple of buttons. The Khan Academy provides 2,700 high-quality micro-tutorials on the web. Any of us can access that level of mathematical learning for free. And scientific publications like Science are even now building their own systems of educational content. So the range of material which is there and capable of being accessed is unimaginably greater than any of us might have conceived. But it's not just content. It's the way in which some content can be delivered. Computer games, for many a parent, myself included, can sometimes seem to be a distraction from learning. But in fact, they can become one of the most effective ways of facilitating learning. There are games which have been developed by Marcus de Sautoy, the Professor of Scientific Understanding at Oxford University, which help children to engage with complex mathematics problems that would hitherto have been thought far too advanced for them. And the Department for Education, as well as having met Marcus, is also working with the Li Ka-shing Foundation and Stanford Research Institute on a pilot program to use computer games to teach mathematics. We haven't developed the program, we're just helping them to run a pilot. And Stanford say that it's already one of the most successful educational projects that they've seen. Now, central government, even with the best will in the world, cannot hope to generate the level of innovation that civil society, industry, and individual educators are. What we in Whitehall must do is to enable this innovation, but not micromanage it. And in seeking to enable it, we also need to be clear about what that innovation has the potential to change. I've talked about learning on the web, iTunes U, the Khan Academy. Some of you might have thought, just as I thought right at the beginning, isn't there a danger that this could simply degenerate into education by YouTube? Students passively sitting there while an unresponsive screen passes on information to them in a way which will be automatically less engaging than a flesh and blood and highly qualified teacher. But actually, the potential is enormous. In Singapore, I saw how a group of trainee teachers could observe lessons which were both recorded and also live from a high-performing master teacher in a classroom miles away. Many, many more teachers were capable of seeing superb practice in a controlled way than any of us could have achieved in the physical space of an ordinary classroom. It's also the case that the very best teachers can rehearse the core of their best material until they get it absolutely right, until they reach the Attenborough or Cox or Starkey or Ferguson standard, and then capture that learning and then supplement it by what they do in the classroom. But it's not just teaching, it's assessment as well. Software is now so sophisticated that a teacher can monitor the individual progress of every child during any lesson. And that teacher, and indeed parent if necessary, can provide that child with support in a way which doesn't single out or stigmatize any child who fears that they may be falling behind, and also ensures that material is pacey enough and the challenge is strong enough for those children who are really motoring ahead. And because there's the capacity to pick up problems earlier and to tailor the material diagnostically to the needs of every child, then the aim that we all share of making sure that everyone in a class masters a body of knowledge before moving on to the next stage is easier to achieve. And it's because you can provide that material in a way which is more accessible and which is more sensitively assessed. You can also ensure that the craft of teaching improves. Because I, like many of you, would hate to think that the special moment that comes when the penny drops and the child appreciates what you have done for them could be banished by technology. And it's actually the case that technology can help us to refine our practice as teachers. Michael Nielsen, a mathematician, in his excellent new book, Reinventing Discovery, has actually discovered ways in which teachers can develop better and better feedback mechanisms to discover which lessons have worked, which facts, which proofs, which narratives, which jokes have helped aid understanding. New tools like Google Analytics allow anyone to analyze video for attention second by second in a way that used to be very expensive and complex, but which now allows any of us, even politicians, to discover which of the arguments that we're advancing have stuck and which of the parallels we've drawn have gone over or under their audience's head. Now, of course, in order to invest in this, we need to make sure that we are concentrating our resources in the right way. But that doesn't mean that we're abandoning the importance of making sure that the right hardware is there. I think it's important that decision is taken on a school by school, chain by chain, or local authority by local authority basis, which is why I believe that central government should step back. But one thing that I want to do is to ensure that central government alerts people to the fact that technology in areas like 3D printers is enabling design to take on a level of sophistication and innovation, again, that none of us could have imagined. I've concentrated on what may seem to be two very different areas: a model of school organisation and the promise of new technology. But what unites them is my belief that both of them reflect the most exciting ways of operating in the 21st century. Open, adaptable, innovative, creative. Those are the virtues that any organisation will need to have to succeed in the 21st century. Those are the virtues that have been incarnated by the very best schools in England over the years. And it's the virtues, or those are the virtues, I should say, which lie at the heart of the success of your schools and which will inform, I know, the future successes of the schools network. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
I suspect there might be a few questions in the audience if you're happy to take a few.
Yes, please.
We had an annual assembly meeting earlier today, and a lot of questions were raised through that particular forum. And so if we might start with John Townsley, Chair of the National Health Steering Group, and then open up to others, just down here.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. I've summarised this into two main questions, and it's almost as if this is coming down dramatically in terms of the overall tone of your speech to some rather nitty-gritty questions that were raised. One was specifically to do with your views on the introduction of a change to Key Stage 2 testing, which would result in teacher assessment-based testing at the end of Key Stage 2 rather than external assessed testing, and the concerns across the secondary sector in terms of the impact that might have with regard to progress of young people and the potential inflation of those Key Stage 2 assessments and their impact. A second, and it comes up a lot, I know, but again very powerfully, is a continuing concern, particularly with the arrival of a new Chief Inspector, about the vulnerability of schools in areas of very challenging circumstances within the Ofsted framework, and ensuring that the Ofsted framework does not disadvantage schools that are doing brilliant jobs, or a brilliant job in areas of great challenge and deprivation, through the raw attainment outcome and the emphasis on the importance of progress as being by far the most important measure in terms of an Ofsted outcome. Though they were not the only two, but by far the most significant of the outcomes of that annual assembly today.
Well, they're both intimately interconnected, and it's incredibly helpful to have that direct feedback. Let me try to provide reassurance. On the first part about changes to Key Stage 2 assessment, I think it's a very balanced set of changes that we're proposing. In a way, it's a pity that the two unions, professional associations, I should say, that represent head teachers tend to, this is a gross generalisation, tend to divide along primary and secondary lines. Because the NEHT is a very powerful and effective voice for predominantly primary school heads, and that means that when we involved the NEHT in this process, then there was always a risk that the interests of primary might drive it unduly. But we involved a variety of teachers and others from primary and secondary, and we sought to balance a variety of different principles. In the end, there is a bigger role for teacher assessment in one particular area, and that's the writing paper. And it was felt that this was the paper which was marked most erratically, and in which there should be the greatest room for trusting professionals. And a persuasive case was made. But at the same time, there will be a new test which is specifically there to check spelling, punctuation and grammar in order to provide assurance to parents and to secondary schools that children are secure in those areas. And it will be the case that as far as mathematics goes, and as far as the rest of English goes, it will still be absolutely external assessment. So it's a refinement of a particular process. But I should also add that as part of what we're doing in reviewing the national curriculum overall, we're asking ourselves what are the right sorts of mechanisms that we need to have in place in order to give secondary schools satisfaction that students are working at the right level. Because I think that you need to be confident, essentially, that a child is working at an honest and robust level 4 before they can hit the ground running for the secondary curriculum. It's not good enough for a child to be at level 3. That might be an accurate judgment of the level at which the child is operating, but it's also an acknowledgement that that child is not yet in a position where they should be. And I think that what we need to move to is a model whereby, as in other high-performing jurisdictions, we say it is the job of a primary school to ensure that a child has mastered the skills, the knowledge, the level of understanding required in order to move on. I'm not talking about holding children back in the way that they do in France and some other countries. I'm talking about making sure that you have an approach and a philosophy that says the process of levelling is not about finding the right badge for each child. It's about guaranteeing every child getting up to that level, being able to move on. And that's a conversation which we need to have with secondary schools. But I hope that you will find the experience of the adjustment that we've made is sensitive without just being distorting. On the second point, ultimately it's a decision that the Chief Inspector will have to make about how he, or in due course perhaps she, interprets the framework. But one thing that I think we need to bear in mind is that there is a balance. You're absolutely right that if you are in an area where many of the primary schools are weak, where families are under pressure, where attainment has been historically low, where there's a lack of culture of aspiration, and you do amazing things by moving students from a remarkably low level of attainment to one which is even just the national average. You've done something outstanding, and that should be acknowledged. Absolutely. But there are two things that I would take on from that. And in a way I'm preaching to the choir, I suspect here, but it's important that I state it. We need to be aspirational at every level. So, of course, there are explanations for why certain schools are doing less well, and those schools deserve additional resources because of the problems. But we shouldn't put a cap on the level of what we might expect from any school in any area. If there are problems with primaries, then we should tackle them, whether that's removing the chair of governors, the head teacher, finding an appropriate sponsor for that primary, and if it's not a structural solution, finding another way of making sure that that primary is brought up to the mark. If the primary is operating to the best of its ability, but there are problems at home or in the early life of the child, then let's divert resources and energy to that as well. But let's expect that schools which do have challenging intakes can actually do just as well, if everything is aligned, as any school in the country. One of the things I've been most impressed by in the time that I've been doing this job is the way in which the right combination of senior leadership team and teaching in the classroom can ensure that there are schools in some pretty challenging parts of the country that can have academic results and progression rates, the envy of schools in Surrey. So for that reason, I think you're absolutely right that we shouldn't close the door on schools being judged outstanding when they've achieved amazing things, but nor should we say that that should be the limit of our ambitions.
We have a question over here from Paddle 2. If you could stand, please, so we can see, that'd be really helpful. Yes, thank you.
Mr. Gove, you mentioned your hope to attract graduates, talented graduates, to teaching. Can I ask, what advice would you give to a graduate considering a career in teaching, and what might they expect the future to hold for them?
I would say that the first, to try and blend the two together, I would say that there are a few professions that are rising faster in public prestige than teaching. I would say that each new generation of teachers who are qualifying and entering the classroom appear to be better qualified, more flexible, more energetic than preceding generations, and that it is a profession whose reputation is consistently on the up. There's a virtuous circle operating. The second thing that I would say is you shouldn't think of yourself as a teacher as simply the employee of your school, important, or local authority, important as that is. You should feel that you're part of a broader intellectual community in the life of the nation. One of the things that I want to do is to see the interplay between schools and universities become richer and more intimate. So you should expect to be able to spend some time on continuous professional development at a higher education institution during your career. Whether it's acquiring a master's in education, a master's in your own subject area, or simply having the opportunity to acquaint yourself both with deeper subject knowledge and with refinements in pedagogy, that should be part of your work. You should expect to be protected in the classroom from poor discipline and excessive bureaucracy, and you should have a right to ensure that the senior leadership team are behind you in making sure that you're not held back by those. You should recognise that changes in technology, some of which I've touched on here, mean that your work can be more exciting and rewarding than ever. And I would also say that the opportunities for you to move not just up the pay spine, but to take on additional responsibilities, whether they're additional teaching or additional leadership responsibilities, should be greater than ever. And then the final thing that I would say is you're fortunate now in that even though there are occasional differences between political parties, there's a consensus actually around so much of what should be done in education that binds the current ministerial team and people like Michael Barber and Andrew Adonis, and indeed a lot of what Stephen, I know, has been saying, which means that you're not going to be on the receiving end of a titanic political battle, as might have been the case in the 70s and the 80s. You enjoy the solid support of people at the heart of Westminster who want to see your profession become even more prestigious in the years ahead.
Okay, we have a question down here at the front.
Secretary of State, there is a very big elephant in the room, isn't there? But I'm not going to be the one to poke it. Leave that for someone else. Instead, I'd like to congratulate you on again sounding so sincere and knowledgeable, someone who's considered these issues very, very carefully, and how impressive that is in a Secretary of State. Indeed, you seem the sort of person that one would like to go and have a drink in a pub with and perhaps discuss a Shakespeare sonnet or two. You are also the sort of person who came forward 18 months ago, with an inspiring vision. And in fact, I was one of the heads of an outstanding school who responded to that vision, became an academy. And indeed, you've set out how many of the parts of that vision are being put into practice in some places. But I want to just share with you my extreme disappointment that on the ground, day to day, being the head of a converter academy is not the uplifting process. When you said free from bureaucracy, I almost laughed rudely, because dealing with the YPLA is like wading through treacle. And I'm long enough in the tooth to remember dealing with the funding agency for schools. So I know it is possible to have a Quango that does a good job and talks to schools. I'm only allowed to talk to one person at the YPLA, and she never has any answers. She's very nice, but she never has any answers. We've been waiting for 3 months. We're 3 months into our budget, and we still don't know what the correct figure is, because apparently ministers are considering it, but haven't decided, though I rather blame the YPLA myself. And also, can I also say that you said a year ago that you were going to stop specialist schools money being ring-fenced. You were going to give it direct to heads. Heads would be able to decide what they wanted to do with that money. Well, in Lincolnshire and in many other local authorities, it's the local authority that's deciding what to do with that money, and actually they're contemplating it, giving it to primary schools. It's not going to come to my school at all. So that's something that I feel very, very frustrated about. I'm also very frustrated that as an academy head in a local authority where 2/3 of the secondary schools are academies, you're proposing a national funding formula where the local authority will be able to decide how the money is distributed. And I strongly urge you to come up with a formula that gives money to each school, and that school gets the money. Thank you.
Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? But actually what I should say is, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediment. I feel your pain. Well, that's all very well. Get on with it, Gove, is the message that I take away. There are a couple of things I would say. The first is that we've been mildly taken aback, but pleasantly, by the number of schools that have embraced academy status. And I think that while most schools have encountered difficulties along the way, there are very few schools that would go back. I do think, however, that with the weeks and months that pass, some of the frustrations that you have with the YPLA, and in particular the funding formula, are becoming more painful. I suspect, and it's difficult, I know, with an audience as big, I suspect those people who have difficulties with the YPLA find that they are primarily around the calculation of funding and the compliance mechanisms associated with that. That's the main bugbear. The way in which, I presume, and there'll be an opportunity, I hope, for me to hear more about other specific concerns that people have. What I would say is that the complicated funding system that we have at the moment is there because of a desire established by the last government and shared by us to ensure that there is no intrinsic financial benefit to becoming an academy. That as an academy, what you receive is the money that you would have received if you were a local authority maintained school, but you spend it rather than someone else. So when people say, and most people here will know this, oh, academies get more money. Actually, no. We just get our control over a larger slice of what is really our money in the first place. But even as we've moved to try and make sure you have that money, there's been a movement against us from some, though not all, local authorities. And that means that because we calculate part of your budget by, or rather the YPLA does, by replicating what the local authority does, and because another part of your budget, LACSEG, comes from us interpreting the Section 251 form that local authorities fill in when they say what their respective budget lines are, some local authorities have filled in their Section 251 forms in such a way as to deliberately game the system or obscure what's going on in order to make sure that they have a larger slice of the money and you have less. And in some local authorities, they've put up a good reason why they're doing that. In others, frankly, I think they're playing fast and loose. That's why I want to move to a system where there is a single unified national rate of LACSEG. That's why I also want to move to a system where there's a single amount for every student in the country, and then there are additional sums layered on top of that for the poorest students through the pupil premium, and an additional sum layered on top of that to take account of pupils who have English as an additional language, or to take account of area cost adjustments in areas of high inflation, or where there's been an adverse economic impact. But it should be transparent. So you could look in Lincolnshire and you could say every child in Lincolnshire from background X should receive sum Y. And you can compare that with every school nationally. And the local authority, if it's distributing those sums, would have to justify why it was that when the notional sum that you should get would be, for the sake of argument, £6,000 per child, why they are only, in their funding formula, giving you 4.5. And we hope to make that transparent, and we hope through schools fora, which are properly constituted, and which meet in a way which ensures that their decisions are properly scrutinised, they're open, the minutes can be inspected, the decisions can be challenged, that we will not have a situation where local authorities play silly games to favour some schools over others for political reasons, so that the schools in the blue corner get all the money and the schools in the red corner, or whatever. But while that's the method which we've been consulting on, yours is not the only voice which has said to me, you're just being too trusting. If you need to change the system because the money hasn't gone to heads, and now you're changing it to a system where the money still doesn't go to them, as cleanly and clearly as possible, then by the time you get toughed out, you still won't have achieved what you promised to achieve at the beginning. And the fact that you and others have said that means that I'll need to reflect hard during this process of consultation on what the right method of funding reform should be. So that's the high-level argument. On a lower level, I would say the best way in which I can make the case that we need to do X rather than Y is to have hard, granular detail from those of you at the coalface about what's going on. So please email either my special advisor, henry.dezoet, D-E-Z-O-E-T, at education.gsi.gov.uk, or my private secretary, roxanne1.smith, at education.gsi.gov.uk, with specific examples of problems that you faced. Of course you can email me and say, Fred in the YPLA is taking forever to answer a telephone. Could someone please check to see if he's still breathing? But what I'd really value is if you say, this is what I've put in, I don't understand why I've got to fill this form in 23 times, I don't understand why they're asking this question, this is a basic element that I was assured would happen, this hasn't. And similarly, if it is the case that Lincolnshire or any other local authority is playing jiggery-pokery, let me know what the public statement is which is designed to defend their position and what you feel is wrong, because feedback direct from the front line means that it's easier for me to work for you.
Okay, Secretary of State, we appear to have run out of time. We're very grateful that you've been able to take some questions, and I know that you'll be having some continuing discussions with colleagues from the National Head Teachers Steering Group. In a moment, I know you'll be going to enjoy a glass of wine, and we'll make an announcement about when the evening session will be starting. We've got quite an impressive lineup, I promise you. But Secretary of State, thank you very much for coming this evening. I'm very grateful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.